The letter arrived at Ravensleigh on a gray Tuesday morning, sealed with unfamiliar wax and addressed in a hand that clearly belonged to someone unacquainted with the estate. Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Ravensleigh, broke the seal without particular interest. Correspondence arrived daily, and most of it demanded nothing more than his signature and a composed expression. But he had read only 2 lines before he stopped. He read them again. Not because the words were unclear, because he could not quite accept that anyone had written them about a living person. Find Eleanor Fairchild, a husband no respectable man would choose. Someone willing to take responsibility for her before she becomes an embarrassment. Japan. Before we begin, subscribe to the Duke's Diary and stay with this story until the very end. And tell me, which city are you watching from? I want to know how far this story has traveled. The letter had come to Ravensleigh by mistake. This much was apparent from the address written on the outer fold, the ink slightly smeared as though the person who had written it had been in some haste or perhaps some agitation. It had been intended for a solicitor's office in the village of Hartwell, a modest firm that handled the modest affairs of the surrounding families. The postal route between Hartwell and the nearest town passed the Ravensleigh gates, and somewhere in the transfer, the letter had been misdirected and delivered to the estate, along with the morning's proper correspondence. His secretary, a careful young man named Finch, had included it in the stack without noting the discrepancy. The handwriting on the outer fold was not entirely unlike the Duke's own correspondence address, and Finch was new enough to his position that he had not yet learned to look twice at everything. Alexander had opened it. Howe was sitting at the large desk in his study, a room that faced east that caught the morning light through tall windows that had belonged to 3 generations of Ravensleigh dukes before him, and carried in its arrangement and its silences the accumulated weight of all the decisions that had been made within it. He sat as he always sat at his desk, upright, focused, the posture of a man who considered carelessness a form of disrespect toward the work in front of him. He read the first 2 lines of the letter. Then he set it down. Then he picked it up again and read them once more. Find Eleanor Fairchild, a husband no respectable man would choose. Someone willing to take responsibility for her before she becomes an embarrassment. He read the rest of it then, because having begun, he could not in good conscience stop, though he was aware with increasing clarity that he was reading something he had not been intended to see. The letter was signed by a Lady Margaret Fairchild, and it was addressed to the solicitor, a Mr. Aldous Crane of Hartwell, with instructions that were precise and, in Alexander's estimation, deeply unpleasant. Lady Margaret wanted a marriage arranged for her niece, Miss Eleanor Fairchild, aged 26. The marriage was to be accomplished with appropriate discretion. The gentleman in question need not be of high standing indeed. Lady Margaret specified that the social requirements were secondary, but he must be willing to accept the girl and her modest circumstances without complaint, and he must be found quickly before the summer season created further opportunity for Eleanor to, as her aunt put it, make herself conspicuous in ways that reflect poorly on the family. The letter contained no affection, not even the performative variety that people insert into correspondence about family members when they remember that someone else might read it. Lady Margaret Fairchild wrote about her niece the way a person writes about a piece of furniture that has been taking up space in the wrong room for too long. Alexander set the letter down a second time. He looked at it for the moment. Then he looked out the window at the east grounds of Ravensleigh, at the late spring landscape he had managed for 11 years, at the ordered gardens and the tree line beyond them that marked the boundary of his property. He had spent 11 years making certain that everything within his sight was in its proper order. He had done this because order was what remained when everything else had been lost, and he had lost enough. But the letter on his desk was not about order. It was about a woman who had apparently committed the offense of being, in her family's estimation, too much of something and not enough of something else, and who was to be disposed of accordingly, matched to the least objectionable available option, and removed from the household before she could further damage the family's standing by the simple act of existing as herself. Alexander picked up the letter a final time, folded it, and placed it to the side of his desk. Then he called for Finch and informed him that a piece of correspondence had been misdirected in the morning's delivery. He provided the correct address. He did not explain how he knew the letter's contents. but he did not ask Finch to return it immediately. He left it on the corner of his desk for the rest of the morning. Ravensleigh was 3 miles from Fairchild Manor by road and 5 by the path that ran along the shared eastern boundary of both properties, a boundary that had been a source of minor intermittent dispute between the two families for the better part of 2 decades, relating to a parcel of pasture land that the relevant surveys had described with insufficient precision, and neither family had ever conclusively resolved. Alexander knew the Fairchild name as he knew most names of consequence in the surrounding county. He knew that the family had once been rather more significant than it currently was, that Colonel Fairchild, who had died some 3 years past, had been a man of military distinction and moderate property, and that his death had left the estate in circumstances that were widely understood to be difficult, but were not often discussed in polite company, because difficult circumstances and polite company have a long-standing agreement to maintain a comfortable distance from each other. He knew in a general way that the household was presently managed by the Colonel's sister, Lady Margaret, a widow of some years, who had come to live at Fairchild Manor following her brother's death, and that there were 2 younger women resident, a daughter of the Colonel's, whose name Alexander had not previously known, and Lady Margaret's own daughter, a Miss Constance Fairchild, who had been presented the previous season and was spoken of in the way that pretty, agreeable young women of adequate fortune are always spoken of with warm approval and very little specificity. He had not known before the letter that there was a daughter of the Colonel's named Eleanor. I thought about that as he managed the rest of his day. The estate meetings, the accounts, the correspondence with his London solicitors about the northern properties, the conversation with his head steward about the summer's drainage work. He moved through all of it with the efficiency he always brought to the administration of Ravensleigh, the efficiency that he had built into himself over the past decade, as carefully as he had built anything else brick by careful brick. But in the spaces between tasks, in the small intervals that even the most disciplined man cannot entirely fill, he found himself returning to a single question. Why would a family want to hide a woman they found inconvenient rather than simply allowing her to find her own way? The answer that presented itself most immediately was the obvious one: they could not afford to. A young woman of limited fortune in reduced circumstances had very little ability to find her own way without the cooperation of the people around her. She depended on her family's household, on their goodwill, on their willingness to present her in society with the kind of advocacy that made the difference between being seen as a person worth knowing and being seen as a person to be avoided. If her family had decided she was inconvenient, she had very few places to direct that inconvenience. This was not, Alexander told himself, his concern. He had enough concerns of his own. Ravensleigh was a large estate with complex obligations, and the 11 years he had managed it had taught him that the first requirement of responsible stewardship was knowing exactly which problems belonged to you and which belonged to someone else. He told himself this several times over the course of the afternoon. By evening, he was not certain he believed it. Fairchild Manor stood at the end of a long approach road lined with oak trees that had been planted, Alexander estimated, sometime in the previous century, and had been left to grow in their own direction without much guidance since. The result was not exactly an avenue. The trees were too varied in their growth, too individual in their angles, but there was something about the approach that he found unexpectedly pleasing. It had the quality of a path made by repeated use rather than deliberate design. It felt in a way that Ravensleigh's own approach did not like a road that led somewhere people actually lived. He had not come immediately. He had waited 4 days, which was long enough to be deliberate, and short enough that his visit could still be framed as a practical matter. The boundary question was genuine. The surveys were genuinely inadequate, and the question of the eastern pasture land had been pending long enough that raising it now was both reasonable and overdue. He had written ahead briefly and formally to announce his intention to call regarding the shared property matter, and had received a brief formal reply from Lady Margaret indicating that Tuesday would be convenient. He rode rather than took the carriage, which he told himself was a matter of practical preference on a clear morning, and which had nothing to do with arriving in a manner that allowed him to observe the grounds of the estate with some care as he approached. The grounds told him a great deal. The approach was maintained, but not flourishing the grass, trimmed the path clear, but the sort of attentive detail that distinguishes property that is cared for from property that is simply managed was largely absent. The flower beds on either side of the front steps were planted in a way that suggested someone had made decisions about them some time ago, and those decisions had been followed without revision since. The east wing of the house, visible from the angle of his approach, had a section of roof that he noted with professional attention showed signs of needing work, the sort of work that was being postponed. He suspected not from negligence, but from the particular careful management of people who are watching their resources and deferring what can be deferred. The house itself was good. It had good bones, as the people who understood old buildings said the proportions were right. The stone was sound where he could assess it. And the windows, though some needed reglazing, were the large, generous windows of a house that had been built by someone who understood the value of light. It was a house that had been considerable and was currently somewhat diminished, and the diminishment sat on it, the way a winter coat sits on someone who wore it well in better weather. Howe was shown into a drawing room by a butler whose age and dignity were somewhat in excess of the household's current apparent means, and he waited with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting in other people's rooms while they established the appropriate power differential of receiving him at the suitable moment. Lady Margaret arrived with her daughter Constance. She was a woman of perhaps 55, composed and precise in the particular way of women who have learned that composure is the most reliable armor available to them. She was pleasant without being warm, and she managed the opening pleasantries of the visit with an efficiency that suggested she was accustomed to ensuring that conversations proceeded in the directions she intended. Constance Fairchild sat beside her mother, and was as reported pretty and agreeable and carefully completely unremarkable. Alexander accepted the offered tea. He discussed the boundary question with Lady Margaret in the appropriate terms, listening as she offered her perspective on the matter and offering his own. He was attentive and courteous. He did not look toward the door, but he was aware in the careful peripheral way that years of managing difficult rooms had taught him of the moment approximately 20 minutes into his visit when the drawing-room door opened quietly and someone entered. Not Lady Margaret's introduction, not an announced arrival. Someone who had come in to set down a document on the small side table near the window, who had evidently not expected the room to contain a visitor of consequence, and who had stopped briefly in the doorway with the particular stillness of a person reassessing a situation in real time. Alexander turned his head. The woman standing in the doorway was not Constance. She was perhaps the same age, mid-20s, but the resemblance ended there. Where Constance's appearance was arranged and composed, this woman's was simply present, unornamented in any deliberate way. Her hair dark and simply dressed her gown, a deep gray-green that had probably been made for practical use, and had the quality of something worn because it was comfortable rather than because it made a statement. She was carrying a leather document folder and a sheaf of papers, and she had the look of someone who had been working. She looked at him. Not the careful, indirect look that well-bred young women were trained to deploy in the presence of titled strangers. A direct look assessing brief and unself-conscious, the look of someone who was forming an impression rather than managing one. Then she looked at Lady Margaret. Something passed between them. Too quick and too controlled to call a conversation, but unmistakably communicative. Lady Margaret's posture shifted by some fraction of a degree toward the particular stiffness of someone maintaining a pleasant expression over an unpleasant interior reality. "You must excuse the interruption," Lady Margaret said to Alexander. "My niece was unaware we had company." "I can return later," the woman said. Her voice was clear and even, not apologetic. "That would be best," Lady Margaret said. The woman looked at Alexander one more time, just briefly. Just a moment's worth of reassessment, and then she withdrew, pulling the door closed behind her with a quietness that managed to be neither deferent nor defiant, simply practical. Alexander returned his attention to Lady Margaret. "Your niece," he said in the tone of a man making polite conversation. "My brother's daughter," Lady Margaret said. "She assists with some of the household paperwork. She finds the work agreeable." The particular emphasis she placed on agreeable communicated without stating it that this was the limit of Eleanor Fairchild's usefulness and possibly the limit of her capacity. Alexander nodded. He asked a question about the Eastern Boundary Survey. Lady Margaret answered it. but the visit had changed. He found out afterward, as he was being shown out by a roundabout route that required some patience, but very little actual effort. The butler, the dignified aging one, was escorting him toward the entrance hall when Alexander allowed his pace to slow near the open door of what appeared to be a small office or a stateroom. The door was ajar, and through it he could see a large table covered in papers, and at the table, the woman from the drawing room. She had not apparently left the house. She had simply returned to work. He could see even from the corridor that what was spread across the table was not household accounts in the domestic sense. These were land records, survey maps, columns of figures that had the particular appearance of long-term property accounting rather than the weekly management of a household kitchen budget. The butler noticed the direction of his attention, and with the dignity of a man who has served a family long enough to understand which truths are worth protecting, said nothing at all. Alexander said, "The estate accounts appear to be in thorough hands." The butler considered this for a brief moment. Then he said with the careful precision of someone choosing words that are accurate without being imprudent, "Miss Eleanor has managed the property record since the Colonel's death, my lord. She has a facility for it." "I can see that," Alexander said. He continued toward the entrance hall. He accepted his hat and gloves from the footman. He made the appropriate departing remarks to Lady Margaret, who had appeared to see him out with the expression of a woman who had managed a visit successfully and was prepared to consider the matter concluded. He rode back toward Ravensleigh. The morning had grown bright by now, the spring light clear and direct across the countryside, the kind of light that showed everything as it actually was, rather than softened by shadow or angle. He rode at an unhurried pace, because the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment the drawing-room door had opened now had enough shape to deserve proper consideration. Lady Margaret's letter had described Eleanor Fairchild as a woman who needed to be removed before she became an embarrassment. What Alexander had seen in that estate room was a woman who was managing a complex property record in apparent detail and apparent competence. I thought about the land surveys on her table. He thought about the columns of figures the map references, the sheaves of correspondence that had the look of documents in active use rather than documents filed and forgotten. He thought about a woman who had been present in that house for 3 years since her father's death, who had not been introduced at the beginning of the visit, who had been excused from the room the moment she appeared, who had returned immediately afterward to her work, as though the work was simply what she did, and she was accustomed to doing it without acknowledgement. He thought about what Lady Margaret's letter had actually said read correctly. Not Eleanor is useless, but rather, Eleanor is inconvenient. And it occurred to Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Ravensleigh, who had spent 11 years learning to read documents with precision, who had learned at considerable personal cost, the difference between what a situation appeared to be and what it actually was, that those were not the same thing at all. He arrived back at Ravensleigh as the midday sun reached its height and went directly to his study, where the misdirected letter was still sitting in the corner of his desk. He had not yet sent it on, though Finch had reminded him once. He had told Finch it would be attended to. He sat down. He looked at the letter. He did not pick it up. I was thinking about the estate maps he had seen spread across the table in the Fairchild office room and about something that had caught his eye in the brief moment he had paused in the corridor. Among the land records, among the survey copies and account ledgers, he had seen what appeared to be correspondence relating to a drainage issue on the eastern pasture land. The same pasture land that was the nominal reason for his visit. The same pasture land that had been for the past 2 years, quietly and persistently flooding at the northwest corner in a way that affected not only the Fairchild property, but the adjoining edge of the Ravensleigh boundary. His own estate manager had been unable to identify the precise cause. He had spent the better part of last autumn and the early months of this year attempting to address the problem from the Ravensleigh side with limited success. The documents on Eleanor Fairchild's table had included, he was quite certain, a survey map with markings he recognized as relating to exactly that drainage pattern. Alexander sat at his desk for a long time. Then he called for Finch, told him to make a note that he intended to return to Fairchild Manor the following week regarding a specific aspect of the shared boundary survey, and asked him to prepare the relevant Ravensleigh records in advance. When Finch left, Alexander picked up the misdirected letter from the corner of his desk. He read it one more time, the same 2 lines, the same flat and careless sentence that had stopped him a week ago. Find Eleanor Fairchild. A husband no respectable man would choose. Someone willing to take responsibility for her before she becomes an embarrassment. He put the letter down. Embarrassment, he said quietly to the empty study. He thought about a woman standing in a doorway with a leather document folder and a sheaf of land records, looking at him with the direct, unself-conscious look of someone who was forming her own impression and had no particular interest in curating his. I thought about what it meant that she was doing that work, that specific work on those specific records in a house where nobody appeared to know or acknowledge that she was doing it. And he thought about what it would mean if a woman who had been managing a complex estate problem in complete obscurity had in fact identified a solution that his own considerably better resourced team had failed to find. He looked at the letter. Before she becomes an embarrassment, he thought no. I thought the embarrassment is not hers. The question. The real question. The one that had been forming since the morning and had now fully arrived was not about the drainage survey. And it was not precisely about the boundary dispute. It was a simpler and more uncomfortable question than either of those, and it sat in the study with him in the way that honest questions have a tendency to sit with honest men quietly, without apology, and with no intention of departing until it had been properly addressed. The question was this: what does a man of principle do when he becomes aware that someone is being fundamentally misjudged? Alexander had spent 11 years as the Duke of Ravensleigh, believing that the answer to that question was clear. He had learned it through loss, through the particular and irreversible education of watching his younger brother destroyed, not entirely by his own failings, but by the compounded weight of other people's misjudgments, and by Alexander's own failure to intervene in time to matter. He had learned that the answer was act. Look at what is actually true rather than what is convenient. Do not defer the uncomfortable thing until it has become the impossible thing. He had applied that lesson to Ravensleigh. He had applied it to the estate, the accounts, the tenants, the endless careful management of a large property and its responsibilities. He had applied it to everything within his acknowledged remit. He now considered rather more cautious about applying it to anything outside it. He stood from his desk. He walked to the window and looked at the east grounds of Ravensleigh, the same view he had looked at a week ago when he first read the letter, the ordered gardens and the tree line at the property's edge. Beyond that tree line, 3 miles by road, was a house with good bones and deferred maintenance and oak trees that grew in their own particular directions, and a woman who was spending her days working quietly and competently on a problem that multiple other people had failed to solve, being described in correspondence as an embarrassment to be disposed of. He turned from the window. I went back to his desk and wrote the instruction to Finch himself in his own hand. A letter to Lady Margaret Fairchild requesting a more detailed review of the shared boundary records and indicating that his visit the following week would require access to whatever property documentation the Fairchild estate maintained regarding the eastern pasture. He sealed it. He rang for Finch. Then he sat back in his chair and thought with the particular clarity of a man who has made a decision he intends to keep. That the woman they considered an embarrassment had been doing work that nobody was doing for her and receiving no credit for any of it. And that was the kind of thing in Alexander Whitmore's experience that deserved to be looked at properly. He looked out at the evening settling across the Ravensleigh grounds, the long spring light fading into the particular gold of late afternoon, the trees casting their long shadows across the grass, everything in its ordered place. He said nothing. But he kept the letter. The woman they call useless, he thought as the light changed and the evening came on, may be the only person keeping their home alive. He intended to find out. The letter requesting access to the Fairchild property records arrived on a Thursday morning, and Lady Margaret read it twice at the breakfast table before setting it down with the careful composure of a woman who has learned to manage surprises in the presence of others. Constance was eating her toast with the pleasant inattention of someone whose thoughts were largely elsewhere, occupied presumably with the more agreeable considerations of the upcoming summer season. The invitations that had already begun to arrive, the particular question of a new walking dress that had been under discussion with the dressmaker for the better part of a fortnight. She did not look up when her mother set down the letter. She had not developed as yet the habit of reading her mother's silences. Eleanor had. She was sitting at the far end of the breakfast table with a cup of tea she had not yet drunk and a set of drainage figures she had been reviewing since before the household was properly awake, and she watched Lady Margaret set down the Duke's letter and understood from the particular quality of the pause that followed that something had shifted in the morning's arrangements. "The Duke of Ravensleigh," Lady Margaret said in the tone she used when the information required delivery, but she had not yet determined how to frame it. "Intends to call again next week. He wishes to review the property documentation regarding the eastern boundary." Eleanor looked at her tea. "Specifically." Lady Margaret continued, her eyes moving briefly to Eleanor with an expression that was careful and measuring and not entirely readable. "He has requested access to whatever records the estate maintains regarding the eastern pasture land and the associated drainage situation." A small silence. "The drainage records are in the estate office," Eleanor said. Her voice was even. "Yes," Lady Margaret said. "I am aware of where the drainage records are." Another silence of a slightly different quality. Eleanor did not say, "Those are my records. I compiled them. I have been working on that problem for 18 months. She did not say any of this because she had learned with some precision over the 3 years since her father's death, which truths were useful to speak aloud in this house, and which were better carried quietly used when needed and otherwise kept close. She said, "Shall I prepare a summary for his review?" Lady Margaret looked at her for a moment. "That would be sensible," she said. Then she picked up her own tea and the subject was settled, and Constance began speaking about the new walking dress, and the morning resumed its ordinary course. Eleanor returned to her drainage figures, but she was thinking about the Duke. She had formed her impression of him in approximately 30 seconds, which she was willing to acknowledge was not long enough for a complete assessment, but was sufficient for the first important observations. He was not what she had prepared herself for. This required some explanation, because Eleanor was not by nature or habit a person who approached situations with preconceived conclusions. She had trained herself deliberately and over time to look at things as they were, rather than as other people described them, because other people's descriptions had proven in her experience to be unreliable in proportion to how confident they sounded. Her father had taught her that. He had been a military man with a precise mind and a great respect for accurate information, and he had raised her in the absence of a son, and in the presence of a genuine interest in her development to think the same way. But she was also, despite her best efforts, a person who lived in a particular world, and the world she lived in had shown her a fairly consistent pattern when it came to powerful men of significant title and considerable property. She had observed them at assemblies and county dinners, and the occasional formal occasion to which she had been brought as her cousin Constance's less interesting companion. She had observed the way they managed rooms, the specific way a title operated as a kind of advance arrangement, so that by the time such a man actually spoke, the people around him had already determined that what he said would be worth hearing. She had observed how they accepted this as simply the natural order of things, how they moved through the social world with the ease of people who had never been required to prove their right to take up space in it. She had expected the Duke of Ravensleigh to be a refined version of all of this. She had stood in the drawing-room doorway for perhaps 5 seconds before retreating, which was long enough to observe that he was sitting across from Lady Margaret, with an expression she had not expected to find on the face of a man of his standing attentive. Genuinely attentive, not the performed interest of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the particular quality of focus of someone who is actually listening to what is being said and forming real responses to it. He had not looked at her immediately when the door opened. He had finished the sentence Lady Margaret was speaking before he turned his head. That was, she thought, as she walked back to the estate office and set down her documents and picked up her pen and tried to return to her figures, not what she had been expecting. She did not know what to do with that yet, so she put it away in the methodical way. She put away information that needed more time to be properly understood, and she went back to work. The Duke returned on the following Tuesday. The day was overcast, the kind of gray English morning that is not unpleasant but provides no particular warmth or color. And Eleanor had been in the estate office since 7 o'clock, working through a set of survey records she had requested from the county land registry 3 weeks prior, and which had arrived finally the previous afternoon. She was deep in the comparison of two surveys from different decades, one from her grandfather's time, one more recent, trying to establish exactly where the discrepancy in the boundary description had originated, which was the kind of work that required sustained attention and produced in her the particular quality of focus that was the closest she came to something resembling peace. She heard the carriage, or rather, she heard the absence of carriage sound that indicated someone arriving on horseback, and she heard voices in the entrance hall at a pitch that suggested a visitor of some consequence, and she heard Lady Margaret's receiving tone, which was a register she had memorized the same way she had memorized the drainage figures by prolonged and unavoidable exposure. She did not go to the drawing room. She was not invited to the drawing room. She stayed at her table and worked, and she listened to the faint movements of the house around her, and she told herself with reasonable success that whatever the Duke of Ravensleigh wished to know about the eastern boundary could be communicated through the summary she had prepared and left on Lady Margaret's desk the previous evening. She had been thorough. She had included the relevant survey comparisons, the drainage pattern analysis, the probable location of the hydrological problem, and 3 possible approaches to a solution arranged by cost and anticipated efficacy. She had not signed it because she had learned that signed documents created conversations about authorship that were more complicated than useful. She was reviewing the second survey for the 4th time when the estate office door opened. It was not Lady Margaret. It was not Constance, who had never once voluntarily entered the estate office in 3 years of residence. The Duke of Ravensleigh stood in the doorway of the Fairchild estate office, dressed in the practical dark coat he had worn on his first visit, with the expression of a man who has asked a question and followed the answer to its source. Eleanor put down her pen. She did not stand immediately, which she recognized was not the conventional response to the arrival of a duke in one's immediate vicinity. But she was so genuinely surprised that the moment for it passed before her social reflexes engaged properly. "Miss Fairchild," he said. "Your Grace." She rose then with the composure she had learned to assemble quickly from available materials. "I was not aware you had been directed here." "I directed myself here," he said. "Lady Margaret provided the summary document. It referred several times to survey comparisons and drainage analyses that I wanted to understand in more detail." He paused, looking at the table at the maps, the figures, the neat parallel columns of her comparison work spread across the available surface. She indicated that the documentation was maintained in the estate office. Another pause. She did not indicate who maintained it. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I maintain it," she said. He looked at her. Not the brief assessing look she had intercepted from the doorway of the drawing room. A longer one, more deliberate. "Who manages these accounts?" he asked. "I do," she said. He looked at the table again, at the scope and organization of the work laid out across it, the layered complexity of it, the evidence of sustained detailed engagement with a set of problems that had apparently been beyond the resolution capacity of multiple other parties, including. She was now aware the considerable resources of Ravensleigh itself. "Then why?" he said, and his voice was careful. "Does everyone speak as though you contribute nothing?" The question landed with the particular weight of something that has been said plainly in a room where plain speech was not the prevailing currency. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because some people only notice work when someone else receives the credit for it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "May I come in?" he said. It was, she thought, an unusual question from a man in his position, in a house where she held no formal authority. He could simply have entered. The room was not hers. Nothing in Fairchild Manor was hers, a fact that was made clear to her with sufficient regularity that she had stopped feeling it as a fresh pain, and now experienced it simply as a persistent condition of her existence. He did not need to ask. The fact that he had asked was not a small thing, though she did not say so. "Please," she said, and moved a stack of survey records from the second chair to make room. They worked for 2 hours. This was not what Eleanor had anticipated when he crossed the threshold of the estate office, and she suspected it was not entirely what he had anticipated either. But the work had its own momentum once they began, and the particular gravity of a genuine problem, asserting the priority of its own solution over the social requirements of the people attempting to solve it. He had brought folded in the inner pocket of his coat a copy of the Ravensley survey of the eastern boundary, his own estate's documentation, the records his team had been working from. He laid it beside her survey copy on the table, and they looked at them together, and within approximately 10 minutes, the discrepancy was visible to both of them simultaneously. "There," Eleanor said, and put her finger on a notation in the older document, a surveyor's mark from 60 years past, that had been misread in the more recent survey as a boundary indication when it was in fact a drainage reference. The line everyone has been treating as the property demarcation is a waterway marker. The actual boundary is 14 feet further east. Alexander bent over the document. He looked at the mark she was indicating, then at the corresponding point in his own survey, then back. "Which means," he said slowly, "the point where the flooding originates is not on the boundary at all," Eleanor said. "It is 8 feet inside the Ravensley property. The original waterway was redirected at some point, I believe, during the drainage improvements of the last century, and the redirection created a pressure point that has been slowly worsening. What you have been seeing as a boundary problem is actually an internal drainage failure on the Ravensley side, and what the Fairchild estate has been experiencing is the downstream consequence." A silence. "My estate manager has been attempting to resolve this for 18 months, Alexander said, not with defensiveness, stating a fact. "The error in the survey would have made it very difficult to identify the source correctly," Eleanor said. She said it without satisfaction, which he appeared to notice because some quality in his attention shifted slightly. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I identified the survey discrepancy approximately 4 months ago. I have spent the time since verifying it against the secondary records and identifying the probable cause of the original redirection." She paused. "I included the conclusion in the summary I prepared for Lady Margaret to give you." "You did," he said. She presented it as the estate's general assessment. "Yes," Eleanor said in the tone of someone confirming information they had already assumed. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the documents. "The solution, then," he said, "is on Ravensley land," Eleanor said. "A relatively straightforward intervention, the pressure point needs to be properly channeled, which would resolve both the Ravensley drainage issue and the flooding on the Fairchild eastern pasture." She pulled the relevant page of her analysis to the front of the papers on the table. "I have outlined the technical approach here. The cost would be moderate. The work would take perhaps 2 weeks with adequate labor." He read her analysis. She watched him read it. Not the performance of watching, the actual practical observation of someone who had learned that people's faces while they read documents told you a great deal about how they thought. He read carefully, and he read everything, not skimming for the summary, but moving through the full argument. He turned a page and went back to a figure on the previous page to verify something before continuing forward. He was, she thought, a man who read the way she read as an act of genuine engagement rather than a social formality. "This is correct," he said when he had finished. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "That is not how most people respond to having their work validated." "I know it is correct," Eleanor said. "I have been working on it for 4 months. I was not uncertain about the conclusion. I was waiting to see whether you read it properly." A very brief pause. "And," he said. "You did," she said. Something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the preliminary condition for one, a slight shift in the set of his features that suggested the muscles involved were not entirely unacquainted with the movement. "Miss Fairchild," he said, "I should like to discuss the technical approach further if you are willing. I will need to bring this to my estate manager, but I want to understand it thoroughly before I do." "I am willing," Eleanor said. He moved to pull the second chair properly to the table, then paused and looked at the fire at the far end of the room, which had burned lower in the past hour, and was providing rather less warmth than the morning temperature warranted. "May I?" he said, and without waiting for her to parse the question, he stood and moved the chair closer to the fireplace, and then, because the logic of it was consistent, moved her chair to match. It was a small gesture, a practical one easily explained, but Eleanor noted it in the same methodical way she noted the drainage figures and the survey discrepancies and all the other information she collected from the world around her, with care, and with the understanding that small things told you the truth about large ones. She sat in the repositioned chair and returned to the documents. He sat across from her and did the same. He came back on Thursday. This was not technically what had been arranged. The Tuesday visit had concluded with a general indication that the Ravensley estate manager would be in contact regarding the drainage work, and there was no outstanding reason for the Duke himself to return so quickly. He arrived in the mid-morning and asked with the same careful courtesy he had extended on Tuesday whether Miss Fairchild was available. He was shown to the estate office. Eleanor was working on a different problem. The roof section she had identified months ago as requiring attention, reviewing the estimates she had obtained from 3 different contractors in an attempt to identify which represented the most accurate assessment of the actual work required, because the range between them was wide enough to suggest that at least one party did not fully understand the scope of what needed to be done. She heard the knock at the open door and looked up, and she experienced very briefly quickly enough that she was able to manage it before it showed the specific internal surprise of finding that his arrival produced something other than the flat bracing resignation with which she usually received the announcement of anything unexpected in this house. "I have a question," he said, "about the northwest elevation of the drainage map." He did. They spent an hour on it. He had in the interval since Tuesday gone over her analysis with his estate manager and identified one element that he wanted to understand more thoroughly, a technical detail about the angle of the proposed channel that his manager had questioned. Eleanor explained it. She drew a supplementary diagram. He asked 3 further questions, each of which was sharper and more specific than the last, and she answered all of them and found in the answering that the quality of his questions was making her think more carefully about the work than she had when she was doing it alone. This was not something she had experienced often. Most people's questions about her work were either too broad to be useful or too uninformed to be interesting. His were neither. When the drainage question was resolved, he did not leave immediately. He looked at the other papers on her table, the contractor estimates for the roof, and said, "Different problem." "Different problem," she agreed. "May I look?" She passed him the estimates. He read them with the same attention he had brought to the drainage analysis, and after a moment said, "The middle estimate is the accurate one. The lowest is from someone who has not properly assessed the underlying structure. There will be additional costs once the work begins. The highest is from someone who has priced for contingencies that don't apply to this type of construction." Eleanor looked at him. "How do you know that?" she said. "Ravensley has a west wing that was re-roofed 7 years ago," he said. "Similar construction, similar period. I went through the same process." He set the estimates down. "I made the mistake of choosing the lowest bid." "And the additional costs," she said. "Were substantial," he said in the dry tone of someone who has paid tuition on a lesson and retained it. Eleanor looked at the middle estimate. She had reached the same conclusion, but by a different route. The technical language of the lowest estimate had contained inconsistencies that suggested unfamiliarity with older building methods, and the highest had included line items that didn't correspond to what the roof actually required. She had circled those items in pencil. She had not been entirely certain she was right. "I had concluded the same," she said. "But it is useful to have the judgment confirmed by someone who has direct experience with the outcome." He looked at her. "You had already decided." "I had formed a strong conclusion," she said. "There is a difference." "Most people," he said, "would have simply accepted the confirmation and not noted the distinction." "Most people," Eleanor said, "are not responsible for the consequences of the decision." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose they are not." He came back on Saturday. This time, he did not have a specific question prepared, which they both understood, and neither of them addressed directly. He arrived with the general indication that he was passing the estate on the way to a meeting further along the road, and had thought he might inquire about the progress of the drainage discussion with his manager. This was plausible. It was also the specific variety of plausible that is constructed rather than organic, and Eleanor was sufficiently practiced at reading constructed plausibilities to recognize it without difficulty. She said nothing about this. She showed him to the estate office where she had been working, and she showed him the updated plan she had prepared, incorporating his manager's additional specifications. He reviewed it. They discussed 2 points of detail. He approved the approach in terms that indicated he would instruct his manager to proceed. Then he looked at the bookshelves that occupied the eastern wall of the office. Her father's shelves organized in a way that was personal and slightly idiosyncratic mixing. Practical estate management texts with military history, and at the far end, a section of general literature that had accumulated, according to some principle, Eleanor had never entirely been able to systematize beyond things father found worth reading twice. "Your father's library," he said. "Part of it," Eleanor said. "The main collection is in the house library. These are the ones he kept close to his working space." The Duke moved toward the shelves with the particular attention that people who read seriously give to other people's books. Not browsing, but reading the spines. The way you read a face for information about the character of the person they belong to. He stopped at a volume near the end of the estate management section. "Ferguson's Drainage Treatise," he said. "Yes, my father acquired it shortly before his death. He had become interested in the eastern pasture problem, but did not have time to address it properly." She paused. I continued working from it. I took the book from the shelf, looked at it, opened it briefly. His eyes went to the marginalia, the notes in the margins, the underlinings, the small, precise annotations that filled the pages where her father had worked through the text. Then his eyes moved to the different handwriting that appeared further through the book, smaller, neater, her own additions to the conversation her father had begun on the pages. He looked at her. "You have been in dialogue with your father," he said quietly, through the margins of his books. The observation was so accurate and delivered with such complete absence of the slight condescension she had learned to expect from any observation about her habits that Eleanor required a moment before she could respond. "He was very good at asking the right questions in the margins," she said when she could speak in the same even register she always used. "I have been trying to answer them." The Duke replaced this book on the shelf with care. He turned and looked at the room, not the formal assessment of a visitor examining someone else's space, but a different kind of looking slower and more personal. "You have built something here," he said. "In this room, in this work." "I have built what was necessary," Eleanor said. "The estate required management. There was no one else to manage it." "That is not what I said," he replied. She looked at him. "I said you have built something," he repeated. "The fact that necessity created the opportunity does not diminish what you made of it." On Monday, he sent a note asking if she would be willing to show him the section of the eastern boundary in question to confirm the drainage plan's application on the ground. It was a reasonable request. She wrote back that she could be available Wednesday morning if the weather was acceptable. The weather on Wednesday was cool and clear, and she met him at the gate between the two properties. The old iron gate that had been installed at the boundary's disputed point, and which had the comfortable, slightly weathered look of something that had been in place long enough to become part of the landscape without anyone remembering precisely when it had arrived. She had brought the survey maps folded in a leather case. He had brought his own copies also folded, and a compass which she had not thought to bring, and which proved useful in verifying the bearing of the original surveyor's marks against the current landscape. They walked the boundary for 2 hours. They argued mildly about the interpretation of one surveyor's mark, and Eleanor was correct, and he acknowledged this when she showed him the secondary reference that confirmed it, and she noted that he acknowledged it directly rather than through the sideways methods that men sometimes used when they found themselves corrected by a woman. They were standing at the point she had identified as the origin of the drainage problem, a low section of ground where the water table was visible close to the surface, even in the dry spring weather where the redirected waterway had created its slow pressure over decades, when he said without particular preamble, "How long has your family known about the boundary survey discrepancy?" Eleanor looked at the damp ground. "My father noted the inconsistency in his correspondence several years before his death," she said carefully. "He intended to pursue a formal correction, but the process requires county records access and a surveyor's commission, which is neither quick nor inexpensive, and there were other demands on his time and resources. And since his death, I have been working toward the same correction," Eleanor said. More slowly because the same constraints apply with greater force. She paused. The drainage work on your property once completed will effectively resolve the practical consequences of the discrepancy, regardless of the formal correction. I concluded that the practical resolution was the more urgent priority. He was quiet for a moment. You pursued the practical resolution, he said, knowing that the formal correction, the one that would properly establish what your family's property actually includes, was the more significant issue. The estate needed the drainage resolved, Eleanor said. The formal correction is a legal matter that can be addressed separately in the appropriate time, Miss Fairchild. He turned to look at her directly with the full attention she had come to recognize as his characteristic mode of engagement when something genuinely interested him. You have identified a survey discrepancy that meaningfully affects your family's property. You have solved a drainage problem that my estate manager could not. You have done both of these things without credit, without resources that remotely reflect the scope of the work, and without anyone in your household appearing to know or acknowledge the extent of what you have managed. He paused. And your response to all of this, he said, is to prioritize what is immediately practical for the estate over what would actually benefit you personally. Eleanor held his gaze. Yes, she said. That is generally what one does when one is responsible for something. He looked at her for a long moment. I had expected, he said slowly, with the careful quality of a man reformulating an assumption he had not realized he was carrying until it was no longer applicable, that someone in your circumstances would be primarily concerned with the relief of those circumstances. And what had you expected that concern to look like? Eleanor said. Not unkindly, directly. He was quiet. Not this, he said. They walked back to the gate, in a silence that had a different quality than the silences before it, fuller. More considered the silence of two people who have said something real to each other and are letting it settle into its proper place. At the gate, she unlatched it and held it open for herself in the practiced way of someone accustomed to doing things independently, and he placed his hand briefly on the gate above hers to hold it steady while she passed through, and neither of them remarked on it. She was almost at the point where the path curved back toward the manor when she heard him behind her. Miss Fairchild. She stopped, turned. Howe was standing at the gate with something in his expression that she had not seen before in the 3 visits preceding this one. Something less managed, as though the afternoon's walk and the afternoon's conversation had gradually loosened some careful arrangement, and what remained was simply what was there. I should tell you something, he said. She waited. The letter that was delivered to Ravensley by mistake, he said. Several weeks ago. A letter from your aunt to the solicitor in Hartwell. He held her gaze steadily, the way a man holds a gaze when he has decided that the honest thing is the only available option. It was delivered to my estate in error. I opened it before I understood it was not intended for me. The morning light was clear and cold around them. Eleanor looked at him. You knew, she said, what they wrote about me. Yes. A silence. Then you already knew the worst of me, she said quietly, before you ever met me. He did not look away. I knew what they thought of you, he said. That is not the same thing. She stood on the path in the cool morning air and looked at the Duke of Ravensley, who had read a letter about her that no one had intended him to see, and had come to Fairchild Manor with a story about a boundary dispute, and had spent 4 visits learning to read the survey of her actual situation, not the one her family described, not the one society assigned to women of her particular circumstances, but the actual survey measured on the ground verified against the source records. She did not say what she was thinking. She was thinking, and what did you conclude? She was thinking that is still not the same as what I am. She was thinking underneath both of those thoughts, and more quietly than either of them. It matters that he is the one who told me, rather than waiting to see if I would find out. She said none of this. Good morning, Your Grace, she said, and turned and walked back toward the manor, and did not allow herself to look back. But she held the fact of his honesty in the careful place where she kept things worth keeping, and she carried it with her for the rest of the day. She did not sleep well that night. This was not in itself unusual. Eleanor had spent a considerable portion of the past 3 years not sleeping well for the variety of reasons that accumulate around a person when their circumstances require constant management, and their mind refuses, even in the hours designated for rest, to fully release its hold on the problems waiting for attention in the morning. She had developed a pragmatic relationship with sleeplessness. When it arrived, she read or reviewed figures, or simply lay in the dark and thought carefully through whatever problem had decided. It required nocturnal consideration, but this particular sleeplessness had a different quality than the practical kind. She lay in the dark of her room at Fairchild Manor, the room she had occupied since childhood, smaller than Constance's, with a window that faced north and therefore received no direct sunlight at any hour, which she had minded when she was young and had long since stopped noticing, and she thought about what Alexander Whitmore had told her at the gate. He had read the letter. He had known before he ever crossed the threshold of this house what her aunt had written about her. He had known the specific language. She did not know the exact words, but she understood from the way he had spoken that the document had been explicit enough that its content was not subject to generous interpretation. He had known that her family considered her a problem requiring disposal. He had known that the solution they were pursuing was a marriage to whoever could be persuaded to accept the arrangement for reasons that had nothing to do with her happiness and everything to do with their convenience. And he had come anyway. Not she was precise with herself about this, because imprecision was the method by which wishful thinking became comfortable delusion, not necessarily for reasons that reflected any particular interest in her personally. He had come with a legitimate boundary dispute and a genuine drainage problem. The practical purpose of his visits was real. She had verified that herself in the course of the work they had done together. Howe was not a man who would construct an elaborate pretense when a direct approach was available to him. Everything she had observed about him over 4 visits suggested that he found indirection costly and preferred the more efficient path of saying what was true. So the visits were genuine, and he had told her about the letter. That second fact was the one that had kept her awake, because she could not resolve it into a simple explanation. He had told her when there was no practical requirement for him to do so. The drainage work was moving forward. The boundary question was in the process of being formally corrected. There was nothing in the immediate practical landscape that required her to know he had read her aunt's letter. Telling her served no instrumental purpose that she could identify, which meant he had told her because he had decided she should know. She thought about that for a long time in the dark. She thought about what it meant when a person decided that someone else's right to accurate information about their own situation outweighed the personal convenience of keeping a secret. She thought about what it meant when that person was a duke, and the someone else was a woman whom society had arranged into a position where having accurate information about her own situation was not considered particularly relevant. She thought, be careful. She thought, this is exactly the kind of thinking that leads somewhere you have not actually been invited. She thought, you have been here before. The part where someone shows you something that looks like regard, and you begin to construct an edifice on that foundation that the foundation was never meant to support. She thought all of this very clearly and very sensibly, and then she watched the gray northern light begin to appear in her window and understood that morning had arrived and that she had not slept and that she was going to have to spend the day being practical about it regardless. She got up and went to work. The letter from her father's solicitor arrived 10 days later. It was addressed to Lady Margaret. As was proper, Eleanor had no formal standing in the estate's legal correspondence, a fact that had been made clear to her early in the management of the property, and which she had accepted, because the alternative was a confrontation she did not have the resources to win. She would not ordinarily have seen the letter's contents at all. But the solicitor, Mr. Aldous Crane, a quiet, methodical man who had served the Fairchild family for 30 years and had, in Eleanor's experience, a precise and personal understanding of exactly what the colonel would have wished, had enclosed within Lady Margaret's letter a separate sealed note addressed to Eleanor directly. Lady Margaret had given it to her without comment, which was itself a kind of comment. Eleanor took it to the estate office and read it alone. Mr. Crane wrote with his characteristic economy of language. He had been reviewing the estate documentation in connection with the forthcoming boundary correction. The process that Alexander's formal request had initiated through the county records office and in doing so had revisited several boxes of documents that had been filed at the time of the colonel's death. He had found in one of those boxes a sealed document envelope that had been placed in the estate records and apparently overlooked in the confusion of the period following the colonel's death, when the estate had been in the process of transitioning to Lady Margaret's administration, and the organization of the records had been, Mr. Crane's phrasing indicated, diplomatically imperfect. The envelope had been sealed by the colonel himself. It was addressed to his daughter. Mr. Crane had enclosed it with the note. Eleanor looked at her father's handwriting on the outer fold, the familiar, slightly angular script she had been reading in survey margins and account ledgers and the edges of his books for the past 3 years, and she was still for a moment before she opened it. Her father had written the document 11 months before his death. The date was precise and deliberate, the kind of dating that a military man applies to documents when he wants to establish their timeline beyond dispute. He had found in conducting a review of the estate's historical records evidence that the property boundary had been incorrectly recorded in the most recent county survey. She already knew, this part had confirmed it herself. But he had also found something else, something she had not known. The colonel had discovered 3 months before his death that the estate management records for the decade preceding his illness showed systematic irregularities. Not the normal variation of a property managed by multiple hands over time. Deliberate irregularities. Consistent patterned adjustments to rental income figures, to property valuations, to the recorded costs of maintenance works that had either not been performed or had been performed at significantly lower cost than the recorded amounts. Someone had been extracting funds from the Fairchild estate for approximately 10 years. The colonel had documented his findings, carefully, thoroughly, in the precise, methodical way of a man who had spent his professional life understanding the importance of accurate records. He had identified the pattern. He had traced the amounts. He had done everything except formally present the finding, because at the point he had discovered it, he was already unwell, and the process of formal presentation required legal counsel and formal evidence, and a clarity of purpose that his declining health made increasingly difficult to sustain. He had sealed his findings and placed them in the estate records and written the envelope to his daughter, because he had understood, in the way that people understand certain things when they are running out of time, that Eleanor would find them eventually. That she was the one who read the records carefully. That she was the one who noticed when figures were wrong. He had written at the end of the document, in a hand that was slightly less steady than the earlier pages, "I could not pursue this properly. I trust you to know what should be done with it, and when." Eleanor sat in the estate office for a long time after she had read the document through twice. The irregularities her father had identified were not general. The pattern of adjustment he had documented pointed clearly in the way that all patterns point clearly. Once you know what you are looking at, toward a specific period of management, toward the years when the estate's day-to-day accounts had been handled by a specific person, by her cousin's husband. By the man who had managed the Fairchild accounts for the years when her father's military postings kept him away from the property for extended periods. By the man who had died 4 years ago himself, leaving Constance a widow, leaving Lady Margaret to bring Constance and herself to Fairchild Manor, to consolidate the household, and, as Lady Margaret had described it to Eleanor on more than one occasion, to assist in managing the estate's difficult circumstances. The difficult circumstances that her father's document strongly suggested had been substantially created. Eleanor put the papers down. She looked at the surface of her work table, the familiar organized landscape of surveys and accounts and drainage calculations. The work of 3 years. The work she had been doing to maintain a property that had been presented to her as struggling, due to general misfortune and the ordinary difficulties of a military family whose fortunes had declined with age. She thought about the roof that needed repair, the delayed maintenance, the careful management of every small expense that characterized the household's current way of operating. She thought about her aunt's letter to Mr. Crane. Find Eleanor Fairchild a husband no respectable man would choose. Someone willing to take responsibility for her before she becomes an embarrassment. She had assumed, when she learned of that letter, that her aunt's desire to be rid of her was rooted in the ordinary social calculation of a woman managing a household, that Eleanor's independence and opinions, and general refusal to arrange herself into a more convenient shape, had made her an irritant, a difficulty, a problem to be solved. She had assumed the motivation was social. She understood now that the motivation might be considerably more specific than that. A woman who read estate records carefully was a woman who might eventually find what her father had found. Eleanor sat with this for a long time. Then she made herself tea because the morning was cold and she had been sitting still for too long, and there were things that needed deciding that required a clear head, and she drank the tea and thought about what she was going to do. She did not go to Lady Margaret. She thought about it carefully and concluded that going to Lady Margaret was not the correct first step for reasons that her father's document had clarified significantly. Lady Margaret's interests in the current situation were not straightforwardly aligned with Eleanor's, and a woman who understood that fact needed to act accordingly. She thought about Mr. Crane. He had sent her the document. He had done so deliberately, knowing what it contained and choosing to place it in her hands. That was a communication of intent that she took seriously. But Mr. Crane was her father's solicitor, and whatever loyalty he held was to the Colonel's wishes, and whether that translated to effective assistance in the current circumstances was a question she could not answer without understanding the specific legal situation more clearly than she currently did. She thought about Alexander. She thought about him for longer than the strictly practical consideration of the situation seemed to require, which she noted, and then addressed directly in the internal conversation she was having with herself. She was thinking about Alexander because he had told her about the letter, and the fact of that honesty had established something in her understanding of him that now had practical relevance. A man who would tell her an uncomfortable truth when there was no pragmatic requirement to do so was a man who valued accuracy over comfort. A man who valued accuracy over comfort was a man who could be trusted with accurate information. That was the practical reasoning. She was also thinking about him for reasons that were not entirely practical, which she acknowledged, and then set carefully to one side, because the present situation had more urgency than she could afford to dilute. She wrote him a note. Brief, formally worded, requesting that he call at Fairchild Manor at his earliest convenience regarding a matter connected to the estate boundary documentation. She sent it with the household messenger before she had time to reconsider the decision. He arrived the following afternoon. She received him in the estate office, which had by now acquired the character of the room where they actually spoke to each other, as opposed to the drawing room where the social performance of his visits was conducted. Lady Margaret knew he had come. She could not have avoided knowing, given the size of the household and the particular way news of significance moved through it, but she did not appear. Constance, Eleanor knew, was at an afternoon engagement in the village. The office was quiet. She gave him her father's document to read. She did not explain it first. She handed it to him and watched him read it with the full, careful attention she had come to associate with him. The attention that moved through a document. The way she moved through a document without skipping, without assuming the conclusion before it was reached. When he finished, he looked up. "Your father found this," he said. "3 months before his death," Eleanor said. "He documented it and secured it in the estate records and addressed it to me. I received it yesterday through Mr. Crane." "Who else has seen it?" "No one. Mr. Crane presumably reviewed it enough to understand its nature before forwarding it. Beyond that, only me." She paused. "And now you." He looked at the document again, the particular look of someone considering implications. "You understand what this establishes," he said. "I understand what it suggests," Eleanor said carefully. "Establishing it formally is a different and more complex matter. The original account records for the relevant period would need to be examined by someone qualified to render a legal opinion. The pattern my father identified would need to be verified against source documents, some of which may no longer be intact." "May no longer be intact," he repeated in the tone of someone noting that a thing left unsaid has still been said. "Records from that period are not as complete as they should be," Eleanor said. "Some appear to have been misfiled. Others may have been removed. I have not made a comprehensive assessment." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to help you," he said. Eleanor had been expecting this. She had been preparing for it since she wrote the note the entire time between sending it and his arrival, preparing for the particular kind of offer that comes from people who have power and goodwill and a genuine desire to use the first in service of the second. and who do not always understand that being helped for someone in her position carries its own costs. "I know you do," she said, "and I am grateful for the intention. But," he said, "but I have spent 3 years in this house being told in 100 different ways that I am incapable of managing my own affairs." She met his gaze directly. "I have managed them anyway, not because I needed to prove something to anyone in particular, but because they required managing, and I was the only person who understood them well enough to do it." She paused. "If I hand this to someone else now, even someone I trust, even someone with the resources to pursue it properly, I become, again, the woman who needed someone to step in, who could identify the problem but could not address it without assistance." He looked at her. "That is not how I would see it," he said. "I know that," she said. "But it is how I would see it, and I have to live inside my own understanding of myself, which means the distinction matters." A silence. "Then what are you asking?" he said. "I am asking for information," she said. "You know people in the county's legal and administrative structure. You have experience with estate disputes and the processes involved in formally investigating financial irregularities. I do not have that knowledge, and I cannot acquire it quickly enough on my own." She held his gaze. "I am asking you to tell me what I need to know to pursue this correctly. Not to pursue it for me. To give me what I need to pursue it myself." He looked at her for a long moment. "There is a difference," he said slowly, "between asking for tools and asking for someone to build the thing for you." "Yes," she said. "You are asking for the tools." "I am," she said. He was quiet again, and she could see him thinking, not managing the conversation, but genuinely working through something, and she waited because she had learned that his genuine thinking was worth the time it required. "The difficulty," he said finally, "is that what you have found is likely to produce a response from Lady Margaret that you may not be in a position to manage alone. When she realizes you have this document, and she will realize it because the process of formally pursuing it requires steps that cannot be concealed from the household, the situation in this house will change, significantly." "I know," Eleanor said. "You would need somewhere to go," he said. "A position from which to operate that is not dependent on Lady Margaret's goodwill." "I know that too," Eleanor said. "I have been thinking about it." "And?" She looked at him. The clear, direct look that she had given him from the estate office doorway the first time he walked through it. The look that she knew by now he received not as a challenge, but as the straightforward thing. It was a person choosing to see and be seen clearly. "I am thinking about it," she said again, more quietly this time. "I do not have an answer yet, but I am not without resources. I have my father's document. I have Mr. Crane, whose loyalty to my father's wishes I believe to be genuine. I have the work I have done on this estate, which constitutes a record of competence that is documented and verifiable." She paused. "And I have the drainage analysis that your estate manager is implementing, which is attributed in the formal communication to the Fairchild Estate's records, rather than to any specific person, which I understand is how it was presented." Something moved in his expression. "I should have ensured your name was on that record," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." It was the first time she had said something directly critical to him, and she said it without apology, because it was true, and because she had decided on the long sleepless night after the gate that the difference between a relationship built on honesty and one built on the performance of agreeability was worth the discomfort of saying the true thing. He held her gaze. "You are right," he said. "I will correct it." "I know you will," she said. "That is partly why I told you." A silence of a different kind than the ones before it. Not comfortable exactly, but honest in a way that honest silences are containing something real rather than something managed. "There is another matter," he said. She waited. "My family is aware that I have been visiting Fairchild Manor," he said. "More aware than is comfortable given the frequency." He said it with the careful precision of a man delivering information that has a shape he has not yet fully named. "My aunt, my mother's sister, who considers the management of my social circumstances a personal responsibility she has not been asked to relinquish, has written to me. Twice. with certain observations about the wisdom of associating closely with a family whose financial circumstances are under discussion. Eleanor was very still. "She is not wrong that your family's circumstances are difficult," he continued. "And she is not wrong that my continuing presence here will be observed and interpreted. In the county, these things become narratives quickly. People have already noticed." He paused. "I want you to understand that I am aware of this, and I am telling you so clearly because you have told me things clearly, and I find I prefer that method." "What are you telling me?" Eleanor said. Her voice was even. She kept it even with the particular effort of someone who is asking a question whose answer they are not certain they are ready for. "I am telling you," he said, "that my family's concern about my being here is the kind of concern that is usually sufficient to alter a man's behavior. That the social calculus of a duke's reputation and a family with documented financial difficulties is not favorable." He looked at her directly. "And that I intend to continue coming here regardless." Eleanor breathed. "That is not a simple statement," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. You understand what it implies." "I have been understanding what it implies," he said quietly, "for longer than I have been comfortable admitting to myself." The estate office was very quiet around them. The afternoon light through the small windows had the particular quality of spring. In decline, still clear, but beginning to carry the warmer undertone of the approaching summer. The light that makes everything look slightly more vivid than it did in the cold months, as though the world has remembered how to have color again. Eleanor looked at her father's document on the table between them. She thought about what he had just told her, that he knew the cost, and he was choosing it anyway. She thought about how that was exactly the kind of information she needed to have, and exactly the kind of information that made her situation more complicated in every direction simultaneously. She thought about the letter her aunt had written. She thought about the document her father had left her. She thought about 3 years of doing necessary work without acknowledgement, and the very particular feeling of having that work seen finally by someone who understood what they were looking at. She thought you have to be careful. She thought being careful is not the same as being dishonest. "I will not become another responsibility you carry," she said. It came out quietly, not as an accusation, but as a fact she needed to establish for him and for herself. "I will not be managed or arranged or resolved. I have been living as someone else's problem for 3 years, and I am done with that, regardless of the intentions of the person doing it." He looked at her. "Then do not be my responsibility," he said. His voice was steady and clear, the voice of a man saying something he has thought about carefully. "Be my equal." The word sat between them in the office where she had spent 3 years doing work that no one acknowledged among the records that told the true story of this estate, under the light that fell without preference on everything it touched. She held his gaze. She did not say yes. She was not ready to say yes, not to what was implied in the word he had used in the way he had said it in the full weight of the exchange they had just had. She was a woman who had learned to test the ground before she trusted it, and there was still ground she needed to walk before she would know whether it would hold. But she did not look away, and she did not say no. Outside the window, the evening was beginning to gather at the edges of the sky, the particular English evening that arrives gently without announcement, as though the day has simply decided to become quieter rather than end. The grounds of Fairchild Manor sat in the fading light, the oak trees, the imperfect path, the garden beds that needed more attention than they received. At the far end of the corridor, she could hear the sounds of the household returning to itself, Constance's voice from the entrance hall, and beneath it, Lady Margaret's measured tone, giving some instruction to the housekeeper. The everyday machinery of the house, doing what it always did, unknowing of what was happening in the estate office. Lady Margaret did not know yet what Eleanor had found. She would know soon enough. Eleanor thought about her father's handwriting on the document between them, the careful military script, and the last lines in the slightly unsteady hand of a man who had written knowing he was running out of time. "I trust you to know what should be done with it, and when." She looked at the Duke of Ravensleigh, who had read a letter that was not addressed to him, and come back anyway, who had said equal in the quiet of this room, as though the word was simply accurate rather than remarkable, who was sitting across from her in the late afternoon with his family's concern and his title's reputation and the full weight of what he had been born into, placed by his own choice on the less convenient side of a decision. She thought, this is the moment, not the dramatic moment, the real one, the moment before anything visible changes, when the choice is made quietly in the part of the self where real choices are made. She reached across the table and turned her father's document to face him. "Tell me," she said, "how to begin." The weeks that followed were the most quietly dangerous of Eleanor's life. Not dangerous in the dramatic sense. No single confrontation, no moment of visible crisis that announced itself with the clarity of something that could be directly addressed. The danger was the kind that accumulates in small increments in the way that water accumulates behind an inadequate dam, invisible from the outside, measurable only to someone paying close attention to the pressure. Eleanor was paying close attention. The morning after, Alexander left the estate office after she had said, "Tell me how to begin," and he had stayed for another 2 hours, going through the legal process with the careful specificity she had asked for, providing information rather than solutions, tools rather than conclusions. She had woken early and done what she always did with new information. She organized it. She made a list of the steps required. She identified the order in which they needed to occur. She noted which steps she could take independently and which required external assistance, and she kept those two categories strictly separate because the distinction mattered to her in ways she had already explained to him and did not need to re-examine now that the decision was made. The first step was Mr. Crane. She wrote to him the same morning, a letter that was precise and careful, and said exactly what needed to be said, without ornamentation, requesting a formal meeting at his office to discuss the document her father had left and the process of commencing a review of the estate's historical accounts for the relevant period. She told him what she had found. She told him what she intended to do with it. She asked him to advise her on the correct legal procedure and to confirm his willingness to act as her father's estate solicitor in the matter. His reply arrived within 3 days. It was brief and warm, in the measured way of a man who expressed warmth through the quality of his precision, rather than through its volume. He confirmed his willingness. He confirmed that the document her father had created was legally significant, that the Colonel's careful documentation of his findings constituted a formal statement of concern that could be entered into the legal record. He provided the name of a specialist in estate disputes whom he recommended and who he noted owed him a professional courtesy. He also noted at the end of the letter, in the same even tone he used for everything, that Lady Margaret had contacted his office the previous week, inquiring about the status of certain estate account records from the relevant period. He had told her that the records were archived and required formal process to access. He had not told her anything else. Eleanor read this final paragraph twice. Lady Margaret was already moving, which meant Eleanor did not have as much time as she had hoped. The invitation to the Fairchild summer gathering went out the following week. This was not in itself unusual. The summer gathering had been a fixture of the Fairchild calendar for as long as Eleanor could remember. Her father had hosted it, as a matter of course, a large afternoon party in the second week of July that served the dual social purpose of maintaining the family's county connections and demonstrating that the estate was in good enough order to support the entertainment of guests. Lady Margaret had continued the tradition since her brother's death, and Eleanor had noted each year that the guest list had become progressively more strategic and the occasion progressively more elaborately managed, as though Lady Margaret understood that the performance of prosperity was increasingly important in proportion to the actual prosperity's decline. This year, the guest list was the largest it had ever been. Eleanor learned this from the housekeeper, who mentioned it in passing while Eleanor was reviewing the quarterly household accounts, a task that had fallen to her without discussion in the first weeks after her father's death, and had remained hers since invisibly, the way all of her tasks had remained hers. The housekeeper said that Lady Margaret had extended invitations to nearly 80 guests, which was more than twice the usual number, and had engaged additional staff from the village for the afternoon. Eleanor set down her pen. She thought about the timing. She thought about Lady Margaret's inquiry to Mr. Crane. She thought about the particular kind of social occasion that requires 80 guests and engaged additional staff, and is planned with the specific concentrated attention that Lady Margaret had been directing at the arrangements for the past several weeks. She thought, this is not a summer gathering. This is a stage. The question was, what Lady Margaret intended to perform on it. Doug. She found out 12 days before the event. She found out because Constance told her, which was not how Eleanor would have predicted she would learn the information. Constance was not generally a source of anything strategically significant, being constitutionally disinclined toward the kind of lateral thinking that concealment required. But Constance told her in the offhand, slightly guilty way of someone who has been instructed not to say something and has found the instruction incompatible with her own fundamental transparency. They were sitting in the upstairs sitting room after dinner. Lady Margaret had retired early, citing a headache that Eleanor recognized as the specific headache she developed when she was engaged in sustained planning that required privacy. Constance was doing embroidery, and Eleanor was reading, and the room had the comfortable, incurious quiet of two women who had long since run out of things to say to each other and had reached an accommodation with the silence. Constance said without looking up from her embroidery, "Mr. Harwick will be at the gathering." Eleanor turned a page. "He is very well established," Constance continued in the particular tone of someone reporting information they have been given rather than forming an opinion. "Mama says he has property in 3 counties and a very respectable income." Eleanor looked at her book. "High is perhaps not very, that is, he is older," Constance said. "But Mama says that is often an advantage in terms of settled temperament." Eleanor closed her book. "Constance," she said, "how old is Mr. Harwick?" Constance's embroidery needle paused. 54, she said in the quieter voice of someone who has reached the part of the information they were hoping to deliver without full attention. "And he is attending the gathering for what purpose?" A brief silence. "Mama thought," Constance said, now addressing the embroidery with great concentration, "that an introduction might be, that is, she thought it would be useful for you to have the opportunity to. She said that Mr. Harwick had expressed an openness to—" "Constance," Eleanor said quietly. Her cousin looked up. "It is all right," Eleanor said. "Thank you for telling me." Constance looked at her with the expression she wore when she suspected things were not all right and lacked the framework to say so usefully. "Eleanor, I don't think—" "It is all right," Eleanor said again, and she meant it, though not in the way Constance might have understood the phrase. She meant it in the way you mean it when you have been preparing for something, and the confirmation of its arrival is clarifying rather than shocking. When the thing you knew was coming finally steps into the light and becomes specific enough to address directly. She returned to her book. She did not read a single word of it for the rest of the evening. She was thinking about what she was going to do, and in what order, and whether she had enough time to do it properly. The gathering was 12 days away. The legal process she had set in motion with Mr. Crane was moving, but slowly. These things moved slowly by design, because the people who designed legal processes understood that speed and precision are rarely compatible. She had enough documentation to support the formal inquiry, but not yet enough to constitute a conclusion that could be publicly presented. 12 days was not enough time to finish it. Which meant that if Lady Margaret intended to use the gathering to arrange Eleanor's future in front of 80 witnesses, Eleanor would need to make her own decisions before that arrangement could be presented as a settled matter. She went to her room and sat at her writing table and did not write anything for a long time. She was thinking about what she wanted, not what was practical, not what was strategic. What she actually wanted, which was a question she had spent 3 years deferring, because the wanting was not relevant to the managing, and the managing was what was required. She thought about a man who had come to her estate office with a boundary dispute and stayed for the work. She thought about the way he read documents the same way she read them from the beginning, without skipping. She thought about a repositioned chair moved closer to the fire without ceremony or performance. She thought about the word equal said, plainly in the afternoon light. She thought about what her father had written. "I trust you to know what should be done with it and when." She picked up her pen. She wrote to Alexander. He arrived the following morning before 9 o'clock, which told her he had received the note the previous evening and ridden early, which told her something she filed carefully alongside everything else she was keeping. She met him at the gate, the iron gate between the properties which had acquired over the course of their various meetings, the character of a neutral location, equally neither of theirs, and therefore paradoxically equally both. She told him about Harwick. She told him about the gathering. She told him what she believed Lady Margaret intended, and why she believed the timing was connected to the inquiry she had set in motion through Mr. Crane. He listened without interrupting. Which she had learned was his manner. When the information was serious, he did not speak over what he was still processing, and she had come to value this in proportion to how unusual it was. When she had finished, he said, "She is trying to resolve the situation before the inquiry becomes visible." "Yes," Eleanor said. "If I am formally engaged, particularly if the engagement is announced publicly in front of the county, it becomes socially very difficult for me to pursue a legal matter against her interests. A woman acting under the direction of a fiancé is in a different position than a woman acting independently, particularly a fiancé she has not chosen and would not choose." "Particularly that," Eleanor agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the boundary between the two properties, the line in the landscape that they had walked together that she had mapped and measured and understood better than anyone else alive. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "I am going to attend the gathering," he said. She studied his face. "You were not invited." "I will be. I will write to Lady Margaret today, expressing my wish to attend and indicating that there is a matter connected to the boundary documentation that I would like the opportunity to address with her. She will invite me." A pause. "She will not feel she can decline an invitation to a duke. Not in front of 80 guests worth of social exposure." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "And what will you do when you are there?" He met her gaze directly. "Whatever is necessary." "That is not specifics enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. Because what is necessary will depend on what happens, and I would rather not plan a performance when the honest version of what I intend to say will serve better than a rehearsed one." He paused. "What I can tell you is that I will not stand in that room and watch your aunt arrange your future as though you have nothing to say about it. Not because you need me to say something in your place, but because I am not willing to be silent while someone is publicly misjudged in front of 80 people when I know the truth of it." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "You understand what attending will mean," she said. "The speculation it will generate. What people will conclude about why you are there." "Yes," he said. "Your aunt has already written to you twice. She has written 3 times as of yesterday," he said in the dry tone that she had come to recognize as his particular version of acknowledging something uncomfortable without being defeated by it. "She is persistent. She is also, I have decided, not correct." "About what?" "About the calculation." He looked at the boundary line. "She argues that the social cost of associating closely with a family in your circumstances outweighs whatever personal consideration I might have. She presents it as a straightforward equation." He paused. "She has forgotten to include one variable, which is that a man who allows a straightforward calculation to override his understanding of what is true and what is right ends up, in my experience, with a very efficient life and very little worth preserving in it." He said it quietly, without drama, in the tone of a man who has reached a conclusion over time and is now simply reporting it accurately. "I watched my younger brother make that calculation in reverse, chose personal feeling over responsibility. And I have spent 11 years believing that the correct response to that lesson was to feel nothing personally and manage everything responsibly. I have been," he said, "wrong about that." Eleanor was still. "It is not a choice between personal feeling and responsibility," he said. "That is a false arrangement. The real question is whether the personal feeling is honest and whether the responsibility is genuine. And if both of those things are true—" He looked at her. "Then they are not in opposition. They are the same thing." The morning was clear around them, the summer already present in the warmth of the light, the county lying green and specific in every direction. Eleanor thought about her father's document, about the careful military handwriting that had trusted her to know what to do and when. She thought, this is when. The Fairchild Summer Gathering was held on a Saturday in the second week of July. The day was warm and clear, in the way that English summer days are occasionally warm and clear, as though the weather has decided at intervals to demonstrate that it is capable of beauty when it chooses to make the effort. The grounds of Fairchild Manor received the light. Well, the oak trees dappling the approach, the gardens properly attended, for once the house itself, presenting its best face with the particular grace of old buildings that understand occasion. 80 guests arrived between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. Eleanor moved through the gathering in the way she had always moved through occasions in this house, useful present, directing the staff on the arrangements that Lady Margaret had planned, and which Eleanor was executing because she was the one who knew where the extra folding chairs were stored, and how the kitchen timing needed to be managed, and which guests needed to be positioned away from which other guests, for reasons of old disagreements that Lady Margaret had forgotten, but Eleanor had filed. She did this without being asked, because it was necessary, and she had long since stopped requiring acknowledgement for necessary work. She had dressed carefully. Not elaborately, she owned nothing elaborate, and this was not the occasion for pretense, but with intention. The blue-green dress that suited her best, properly pressed. Her hair arranged simply and correctly. The particular quality of composure that she wore when she needed to be steady, regardless of what the day produced. Lady Margaret had introduced Mr. Harwick to her at 2:15. How was exactly as she had expected, a large, comfortable, self-satisfied man of 54, who had been told that an introduction would be made, and had arrived in the expectation that the subsequent arrangements would follow naturally. The way arrangements follow, when one party has all the social advantages, and the other has very few. He was not unkind, he was not interesting. He spoke to her in the tone of a man who has been told a thing is agreeable, and is performing the appropriate response to agreeableness, without particular personal engagement. Eleanor was pleasant. She was polite. She excused herself at the earliest graceful opportunity to attend to a question about the afternoon tea arrangement, and she spent the next 40 minutes ensuring that the gathering functioned correctly, and that she remained at any given moment on the opposite side of it from Mr. Harwick. Lady Margaret's eyes followed her. Eleanor noticed, and did not show that she noticed, which was a skill she had been practicing since she was 19 years old. At 3:30, she heard a change in the gathering's particular murmur, the specific shift in the quality of social noise that occurs when someone arrives who commands immediate attention. She had been expecting it. She had known from his note the previous day, confirming his intention that he would come. She did not look toward the entrance immediately. She was standing near the garden boundary, in conversation with the county land agent about a drainage question he had sought her out to ask. He was one of perhaps 4 people at the gathering who understood the work she did and treated the knowledge with appropriate seriousness, and she finished answering his question before she looked toward the entrance where Alexander was standing. He had arrived in the formal manner appropriate to the occasion, correctly dressed. Composed, the full authority of his bearing and his title present in the room, the way it was always present, the social weight of it operating before he said a word. Lady Margaret was receiving him with the specific expression of someone who had expected this, but had not quite believed it until this moment. He looked across the gathering. He found her immediately. She was standing at the garden boundary in a blue-green dress she had chosen with intention, and he looked at her in the direct way she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things, without the oblique social management of other people's eyes, without the studied casualness of someone who needs to conceal the direction of their attention. He looked at her as though looking at her was accurate, and he saw no reason to be inaccurate. Then he moved into the gathering, and the afternoon continued. Lady Margaret made her announcement at 4:45. Eleanor had known it was coming. She had recognized the gathering of the senior guests near the garden terrace, the particular way Lady Margaret had been managing the room's geography for the past hour, drawing certain people together, positioning. Mr. Harwick at the edge of the terrace group. The small orchestrations of a woman who was constructing a public moment with the same careful attention Eleanor brought to a drainage analysis. She was standing near the library window when she heard Lady Margaret's voice rise slightly above the surrounding conversation with the specific elevation of pitch that indicates a person is about to say something they intend to be heard by more than their immediate neighbors. "I am so pleased," Lady Margaret said, "to have the opportunity today to share news that our family has been very much anticipating." Lady Margaret. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality that certain voices develop when they have spent years being the voice in the room that mattered. A clarity and a weight that cut through the surrounding noise without effort, the way a bell cuts through conversation. The gathering went quiet. Alexander was standing at the edge of the terrace group. He had moved. Eleanor realized while she had been watching, Lady Margaret had moved through the gathering. Without hurry, had positioned himself precisely where the announcement was about to be made, had arrived at the moment required by the occasion rather than before or after. Lady Margaret looked at him. "Your Grace?" she said in the tone of someone maintaining composure over a significant surprise. "Forgive the interruption," he said in a tone that did not ask for forgiveness, because it understood it was not required. "I should like, if I may, to say a few words about a matter that I understand has been a topic of some arrangement this afternoon." The gathering was very still. Eleanor was still. He looked toward her directly. Clearly, the same look he had given her across the gathering when he arrived, and she understood from it that whatever he was about to say, he had decided on his own terms, and she had not been consulted, and she was not required to approve of it, but that he was not going to pretend she was not there. He turned back to the assembled guests. "I have had occasion over the past several weeks to spend considerable time at Fairchild Manor in connection with a shared boundary matter," he said. "In the course of that work, I have reviewed the estate's land documentation, the drainage analysis, and the historical property records in some detail." He paused. The pause was not theatrical. It was the pause of a man choosing the most accurate words rather than the most impressive ones. "What I found was this, that the Fairchild estate has been managed for the past 3 years with a level of intelligence, precision, and genuine competence that would be considered remarkable in any steward or estate professional in this county." A murmur through the gathering. Not dramatic, a quiet adjustment, the sound of 80 people recalibrating. "The person responsible for that management," he said, "has not been acknowledged for it. The work has been attributed to the estate generally, or to Lady Margaret's oversight, or simply left unattributed, in the way that certain kinds of work are always left unattributed when the person performing them is easy to overlook." He looked briefly at Lady Margaret, whose composure remained intact and whose expression did not. "It would not be honest for me to stand in this gathering and remain silent while an arrangement is presented that treats that person as a burden to be allocated, rather than a person whose judgment and contributions merit recognition." Lady Margaret said with remarkable control, "Your Grace, this is perhaps not the occasion. Miss Fairchild identified a survey discrepancy that has affected this estate's property boundary for 60 years, he said without raising his voice. "She isolated the source of a drainage failure that my own estate professionals could not identify in 18 months of trying. She has been managing the financial and property records of this estate under conditions that would have defeated most people. And she has done all of this while being described in correspondence I have personally seen as a problem to be solved before she becomes an embarrassment." The last phrase fell into the quiet of the gathering with the weight of something precise and irrefutable. "The world has called her difficult because she refused to become small enough for their comfort." He stopped. The gathering was entirely silent. Eleanor was standing at the library window, and she was not invisible. She had not been invisible since the moment he arrived, and she understood that she was being seen by 80 people simultaneously in a way she had never been seen in her life, and she kept her chin level and her hands steady, and she did not look away from him. "I am not here to rescue Miss Fairchild," he said, and looked at her directly, and she understood that the last statement was for her as much as for the gathering, perhaps more. "She does not require rescuing. She requires only what every person of competence and integrity requires, that the truth of what she is and what she has done be acknowledged by the people around her." He paused. "I am acknowledging it, for whatever my acknowledgement is worth." He inclined his head slightly, not a bow, something more personal, and then stepped back from the center of the terrace. The gathering remained quiet for a moment, that felt much longer than a moment. Then the county land agent, who had been standing near the garden, began to speak something specific, something about the drainage work directed to the man beside him, and the ordinary sound of the gathering slowly resumed. The way sound resumes when a room has absorbed something significant and returned to the practical business of existing around it. Lady Margaret had not moved. Mr. Harwick had found a conversation near the refreshment table. Constance was looking at Eleanor from across the gathering, with an expression of surprised relief that was the most genuine thing Eleanor had ever seen on her cousin's face. She found him at the boundary of the garden, where the formal grounds gave way to the less formal edge of the property, near the oak trees that grew in their own particular directions. He had moved there without appearing to retreat, simply stepped to the edge of the occasion and waited. Which was, she had come to understand, a characteristic behavior of someone who preferred the edges of gatherings to their centers. She crossed the garden to him. She said, "You did not tell me you were going to do that." "No," he said. "I would have told you it was unnecessary." "I know," he said. "That is partly why I did not tell you." She looked at him. "That is not a satisfying explanation. It is an honest one." He met her gaze. "You would have told me it was unnecessary because you have spent 3 years concluding that asking for acknowledgement is a form of weakness. You have been wrong about that for 3 years, and I was not willing to let you continue being wrong about it in front of 80 people. She was quiet for a moment. "Your family," she said, "will have opinions," he said. "They have already been having opinions. Their opinions at this point have been fully considered and weighed against my own." A pause. "My own have come out heavier." Eleanor looked at the oak trees, the irregular, self-directed growth of them, the way they had become what they were by following no one else's arrangement. She thought about what he had said in there. Not the part that was for the gathering, the part that was for her. She does not require rescuing. He had understood that. He had said it in front of 80 people as a clarification of his own position, not a gallant intervention on behalf of someone helpless, but a public acknowledgement of someone capable from a man who had seen the capability and decided it was worth saying plainly. "Why would a duke," she said slowly, looking at the trees, "risk everything for someone society overlooked?" She felt him look at her. "Because society was wrong," he said, simply, without elaboration. The way he said things that were simply true. She turned to look at him. I was watching her with the full, clear attention that had been the first honest thing she had known about him. The attention that looked for what was actually there rather than what was expected or convenient. "I told you," she said quietly, "that I would not become another responsibility you carry." "I remember," he said, "and I told you that I will not be managed or arranged." "You did," he said. "I have been listening." "Then you understand," she said, "that whatever I decide, whatever I choose, it has to come from me. Not from gratitude, not from circumstances, not from finding myself publicly positioned in a way that makes a particular choice the socially obvious one." "Yes," he said. "I understand that. You understand that I may need time." "I understand that you may need time," he said. There was something in his voice, not impatience, nothing like impatience, but the particular quality of a man who has said everything honest he has to say, and is now simply present, waiting in the way that people wait when they are not attempting to manage the outcome. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the estate office, and the surveyor's marks, and the repositioned chair. She thought about the word equal. She thought about her father writing, "I trust you to know what to do and when," in the slightly unsteady hand of someone who was running out of time and needed the person he was trusting to understand it fully. She thought about 26 years of being told she was too much of some things and not enough of others, and how the most honest response to that information she had ever found was to continue being exactly what she was and let the assessment revise itself in proportion to its own accuracy. She thought, "I know what I want." She thought the wanting is not the weakness. The wanting honestly is the opposite of weakness. She looked at him, and she said in the clear, direct voice she used for accurate information, "I am not asking you to wait indefinitely." He looked at her. "I am asking you to wait until the inquiry is concluded," she said, "until what my father found has been properly established through the correct process, and Lady Margaret's management of this estate has been formally examined, and I am standing on ground that is entirely my own, rather than ground that someone else arranged for me." She paused. When that is done, and I am choosing from a position that is genuinely mine, then we will talk. Yes, he said. One word. Clear and without qualification. She nodded. She turned toward the gathering, toward the manor, toward the remaining hour of the occasion that she would manage as she had always managed it, with competence and without acknowledgement. Acknowledgement, though, she suspected the acknowledgement had shifted in some permanent way this afternoon. She stopped. She turned back. What you said in there, she said, about being wrong for 11 years. She met his eyes. I have been wrong about some things too, for a similar length of time. She paused. I thought being chosen meant being found acceptable. I understand now that it means being found true. He looked at her. Yes, he said again in the same quiet, clear voice. She walked back toward the gathering. Behind her, among the irregular oak trees that grew in their own directions, she heard nothing. No footsteps following, no call to return, no gesture designed to draw her back before she had decided to return on her own terms. He simply waited. That, she thought, was everything. The inquiry took 4 months. Eleanor had known it would take time. Mr. Crane had told her from the beginning that these processes moved at the pace of institutions, rather than the pace of people, which was to say slowly, and with considerable paperwork, and a preference for procedure over urgency that could be maddening when urgency was what the situation felt it deserved. She had accepted this because she understood that a conclusion reached correctly was worth more than a conclusion reached quickly, and because she had spent 3 years learning patience in conditions that would have exhausted most people's supply of it entirely. She moved through those 4 months with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The formal inquiry into the Fairchild estate accounts was conducted through the county legal process that Mr. Crane had outlined, a careful documented examination of the historical records for the relevant decade conducted by the specialist. He had recommended a Mr. Birch, who was a compact and precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the particular manner of someone who found irregularities in financial records the way other people found satisfaction in completing a puzzle. How was thorough? He was unhurried. He communicated his progress to Eleanor through Mr. Crane in letters that were dense with specific detail and entirely without dramatic embellishment, which she found deeply reassuring. The irregularities her father had identified were confirmed, and then exceeded. The full scope of what had been extracted from the Fairchild estate over the relevant decade was larger than the Colonel's document had established. He had found the pattern, but had not lived long enough to trace it completely. Mr. Birch traced it completely with the specific satisfaction of a man doing exactly the work he was built for, and the figure he arrived at was significant enough that when Mr. Crane communicated it to Eleanor in their 3rd formal meeting, she sat with it for the full minute in silence before she was able to respond. Her father's estate had not declined through misfortune and the ordinary difficulties of a military family's reduced circumstances. It had been systematically depleted by the person entrusted to manage it during the years he was away. Lady Margaret had known. The inquiry established this. Not directly, there was no letter, no explicit document confirming her knowledge, but through the pattern of her subsequent decisions. The decision to come to Fairchild Manor after her brother's death. The decision to take control of the household and its administration. The careful management of Eleanor's access to certain records. The letter to Mr. Crane about finding Eleanor a husband, written at precisely the moment when Mr. Crane had been engaged to review the boundary documentation, and might in the course of that review have encountered what Eleanor eventually found. The timing was not coincidental. Eleanor sat with all of this in Mr. Crane's office on a gray October morning, with the rain against the window and the carefully documented truth of her family's situation laid out in front of her, and she felt not anger exactly, though anger was present. Something older and more complicated than anger. Something that was partly grief for the version of her circumstances she had believed was simply misfortune, and now understood was something else entirely. And partly she examined this carefully because she owed it precision, a specific settled clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when a pattern you have been looking at from the wrong angle finally resolves into the thing it actually is. She had not been difficult. She had not been too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. She had been from the very beginning someone who read the records carefully enough to eventually find what was in them. And that was what had made her inconvenient. Not her character, not her independence, or her education, or her opinions. Simply her attention. Her refusal to stop looking at things until she understood them correctly. She had been correct about herself all along. She drove back to Fairchild Manor in the hired carriage through the autumn rain, and she sat in the estate office one last time and looked at the shelves she had organized and the records she had maintained, and the work of 3 years spread around her in the particular order she had created for it, and she thought about her father's handwriting in the margins of his books. "I trust you to know what to do and when." She had known. She had done it. She had finished it. The legal resolution was not dramatic. Legal resolutions rarely were in Eleanor's experience, which was now more extensive than she had ever anticipated acquiring. Lady Margaret was confronted with the findings through the formal process. Mr. Crane delivered the documentation with the measured precision of a man who had served the colonel for 30 years and had his own precise understanding of what justice looked like in this particular situation. There were meetings. There were formal discussions conducted in the language of legal necessity rather than personal reckoning, which Eleanor found on reflection was probably better. Personal reckoning had a satisfying quality in imagination that was often less useful in practice than the quiet documented assertion of what was actually true. Lady Margaret did not contest the findings. This was Mr. Crane, indicated the sensible decision. The documentation was too complete and too carefully assembled to be effectively challenged, and the social cost of a public legal contest would have exceeded even the cost of the settlement. Lady Margaret's composure, which had survived everything Eleanor had observed over 3 years, held through the formal process in the way that certain structures hold under pressure completely, and then all at once. The composure that had been managing things folded into something smaller and more honest when the management was no longer possible. Eleanor was not present for that. She did not need to be. She received the formal confirmation of the settlement from Mr. Crane on a Tuesday morning in November. A letter that was brief and precise and contained in its final paragraph a notation that the Fairchild estate's outstanding obligations had been satisfied and the property records corrected to accurately reflect the estate's actual holdings and their unencumbered status. She read it twice. Then she put it in the same drawer where she kept her father's document and her tools and the Ferguson drainage treatise with both their handwritings in the margins, and she went to write a letter to Alexander. He arrived at Fairchild Manor that afternoon. She was waiting in the estate office where else, and she heard the familiar sound of a horse rather than a carriage, and the familiar set of footsteps in the corridor. And then he was in the doorway, in the same dark practical coat he had worn the first time he stood there, when she had not stood up immediately because surprise had delayed her social reflexes, and he was looking at her the same way. He had looked at her then with the attention that was not examination, but genuine, careful seeing. "It is done," she said. "Yes," he said. "Mr. Crane wrote to me as well." She nodded. He would. He came into the office. He sat in the chair across from her, the chair that had been repositioned closer to the fire months ago, and had not moved back to its original location since because neither of them had moved it, and neither of them had discussed the fact that neither of them had moved it. He sat in it with the ease of someone sitting in a place that has become familiar, and he looked at her with the full, clear attention. "How are you?" he said. "Not what will you do now. Not the situation is resolved. Simply, how are you?" She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she knew to think about things. "I am tired," she said, in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has just set it down, and the tiredness is partly relief and partly the strange unfamiliarity of having empty hands. She paused. I am well. I believe I am genuinely well, which is a thing I have not been certain of for quite some time." He nodded. "And you," she said. "Your family." "My aunt has been thoroughly expressing her views since July," he said in the dry tone that she associated with his particular way of managing things that were difficult but not defeating. She reached the limit of her available vocabulary on the subject approximately 3 weeks ago, and has since shifted to pointed silences, which I find considerably more restful. "And your position?" "Is unchanged," he said. "In every respect." She looked at him. She had spent 4 months moving carefully through the legal process, maintaining the steady, methodical attention. The situation required not allowing herself to be distracted by the parallel and equally significant question of what she was going to do when it was finished. She had put that question away with the same disciplined precision she applied to everything, had told herself that it would be answered in its proper time, and that the proper time was when she was standing on ground that was genuinely her own. She was standing on that ground now. "I told you," she said, "that I would need to wait until I was choosing from a position that was mine." "You did," he said. "That was not a condition I placed on you," she said carefully. "It was a condition I placed on myself, because I needed to know, I needed to be certain that any choice I made was coming from who I actually am, rather than from what my circumstances were making available to me." "I understood that," he said. "I know you did." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand something else as well." He waited. "These 4 months," she said. "The inquiry, the process, the conclusion. None of that has changed what I felt in July, when you stood in that garden and told me that society was wrong about me." She paused, choosing the precision she always brought to things that mattered. "It clarified it, because what I have learned in completing this on my own terms is that I was not waiting to feel differently about you. I was waiting to feel differently about myself. And I do." She looked at him steadily. "I know who I am now, not as a conclusion I had to argue someone else into accepting, as a thing I simply know." Something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not with the visible quality of a man performing an emotional response, but in the deep, real way of someone receiving information they have been hoping for, and finding that the receiving is different from the anticipating. Quieter, more serious, more permanent. "Eleanor," he said. "I am not asking for time," she said. "I am done asking for time." She moved to Ravensleigh in December, not immediately, and not without the proper arrangement of everything that needed arranging. There was this matter of Fairchild Manor's future, which Mr. Crane was managing with the assistance of a young cousin of the Colonel's who had expressed interest in taking on the property's administration, and who Eleanor had established in 2 meetings, had both the competence and the genuine affection for the place that it deserved. There was the matter of the staff, several of whom had served the family for decades, and whose futures she was not willing to leave uncertain. There was the matter of the estate records, which she packed herself with the same care she brought to any important documentation, and the Ferguson drainage treatise, with both their handwritings in the margins, and her father's tools that had become her tools, and the collection of books from the estate office shelves that had been her father's, and were now clearly and simply hers. She did not pack anything she did not want. For the first time in 26 years, she was in a position to make that distinction, and she made it with great care and considerable satisfaction. Ravensleigh received her in winter. The estate looked different from the inside than it had from the approach road in those early weeks, larger in some ways, smaller in others, the way any place becomes more specific and more human once you are living in it rather than visiting it. The grounds were bare in the December cold, the formal gardens resting under the particular stillness of waiting, and the house itself was what the house always was, old and solid and full of the accumulated weight of generations, which could feel like a burden or like a foundation depending on how you stood in relation to it. Eleanor stood in relation to it as herself. This required some navigation. In the first weeks, not with Alexander, who had been managing his household according to his own particular system for 11 years, and was she found genuinely and specifically interested in the places where her approach might improve on his own, but with the staff who had developed the careful habits of people long accustomed to a single authority, and needed time to recalibrate to the fact that there were now 2, and with the social world of the county, which had been doing its own recalibration since July, and had reached by December a position that Eleanor characterized privately as provisional acceptance, overlaid with intense curiosity, which was sufficient for her purposes and would improve with time. She established her workspace in a room on the ground floor of the East Wing, a room with good north light, which was what she required, and sufficient space for the kind of work she intended to continue doing. The estate records of Ravensleigh, where she had discovered in her first formal review of them, in excellent condition, Alexander managed his documentation with the same precision. He managed everything. But there were opportunities for improvement in the organizational system that she was already thinking about, and she had identified 2 families in the county whose collections of damaged historical documents were in need of exactly the kind of attention she was qualified to provide. She wrote those letters in the first week of December and received responses by the second. She was not idle. She had never been idle. What had changed was simply that the work she was doing was acknowledged, valued, and in proportion to her actual capacity, which was, she was discovering, rather larger than even she had estimated now that it was no longer being managed in the spaces between other people's requirements. Alexander watched all of this with the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his version of happiness. Not the demonstrative kind, not the performed contentment of a man deciding to appear satisfied, but the quiet, specific pleasure of someone who has arranged his life in a way that is genuinely, accurately right, and finds each morning confirming the rightness of it. He was different, not dramatically different. He was still the same, fundamentally serious, precise, responsible man who had been managing Ravensleigh for 11 years, with the conviction that duty and personal feeling were in opposition, and duty was required to win. But the conviction had shifted. The opposition had dissolved not because he had abandoned his sense of responsibility, but because he had finally applied it to the full scope of what responsibility actually included, including himself, including the simple fact that a man who prevents himself from living honestly is not being responsible. He is being afraid, and that those are not the same thing. She saw it in small ways. She saw it in the morning when he came to find her in her workroom before the day's formal demands began, simply to be in the same space for a quarter hour while the household woke around them. She saw it in the evenings when they sat in the library and he read and she worked, and the silence between them had the quality of something that had been built rather than simply arrived at. She saw it in the way he spoke about his brother, not often, but honestly, with the careful honesty of someone who has accepted that a complicated love is still a love, and that grief and imperfection can occupy the same space in a person's history without canceling each other. She saw it most clearly one afternoon in January when she came to his study to return a reference document he had lent her 3 days prior, and found him at his desk, writing with the specific quality of absorption that she recognized as genuine rather than performed. Not a man working through obligation, but a man putting something true onto paper with care. He looked up when she entered, and the particular expression that he had, the one she had first seen at the gate between the properties, the one that was almost a smile, but more personal than a smile. The expression that belonged specifically to the moments when he was not managing anything at all, arrived on his face in the uncomplicated way it arrived now, without requiring the management it used to require. "The drainage figures from the North Field," she said, and placed the reference document on the corner of his desk. "Thank you," he said. She glanced as she turned to leave at the open journal on his desk, not reading, simply registering that he had been writing in it, that the pages were covered in his precise, angular script, that the writing had the quality of something personal rather than administrative. She did not read it. She went back to her workroom. She found the original letter 3 weeks later. She was not looking for it. She had not thought about it in months, in the sustained practical concentration of the inquiry and the move and the establishment of her new life. The letter that had begun. The whole sequence of events had receded from her active consideration into the category of things that had happened and been addressed and were no longer urgent. She found it in the small writing room adjacent to Alexander's study in the course of reorganizing the correspondence files that had been maintained there in a system that functioned adequately, but had several inefficiencies she had been meaning to address. The letter was in a folder of miscellaneous documents from the previous spring, not filed under the Fairchild correspondence, not labeled, simply present among the documents of that period in the particular undifferentiated way of something that had been put somewhere and then not disturbed. She recognized it before she fully registered what she was looking at. The handwriting on the outer fold, Lady Margaret's precise controlled script, with the slight smear of ink on the lower left corner that came from a pen held under pressure. She held it for a moment. Then she took it to Alexander, who was in the study, reviewing accounts with his estate manager, a meeting she had known was scheduled and which was running to its normal length. She waited in the doorway until the manager had gathered his papers and departed, and then she came in and placed the letter on the desk in front of Alexander without saying anything. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You found it," he said. "In the correspondence files," she said. "In the spring folder." He nodded slowly. He did not offer an explanation for its presence there, which was itself a kind of explanation. He had not filed it and not discarded it, which meant he had made a specific choice about what to do with it, and the choice had been to keep it somewhere accessible, somewhere he would occasionally encounter it in the course of ordinary work. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the chair that was by now simply hers. In this, the way certain chairs become certain people's chairs, in houses where people actually live rather than simply reside. "Why did you keep it?" she said. He looked at the letter on the desk. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was being genuinely precise, rather than managing a pause. "Because it was the first proof," he said, "that the world was wrong about you." She held his gaze. "Not wrong in the vague sense," he said. "Not wrong in the general way that the world is often wrong about people who don't conform to its expectations. Specifically, demonstrably, documentably wrong." He looked at the letter. Someone had written down in their own hand their own assessment, their confident, casual, entirely unchallenged assessment of who you were and what you were worth. And within 3 weeks of reading that assessment, I had sat across from you in your estate office and understood that every single conclusion in it was incorrect. He paused. "I kept it because I wanted the record to be complete. Because I thought that someday, if the rest of it worked out as I hoped, I wanted you to be able to hold both things at once, what they said about you, and what the evidence of your own life said about you." He met her eyes. The distance between those two documents is the entire truth of it. Eleanor looked at the letter on the desk. She thought about the woman who had been described in it, the inconvenient one, the embarrassing one, the problem requiring allocation. She thought about standing in the drawing room doorway at the Fairchild summer gathering and understanding that she was about to be publicly arranged, like furniture being moved to a more convenient room. She thought about crossing the formal garden to find Alexander standing at the oak trees, waiting without managing the outcome. She thought about her father's voice in the margins of his books, asking the right questions in pencil, trusting her to find the answers. She thought about what it meant that the letter was still here, that Alexander had kept it with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. Not as a wound to return to, but as a record. Evidence. The documented truth of a starting point, against which everything that followed could be measured. She reached across the desk and picked up the letter. She looked at it, at Lady Margaret's handwriting, at the sentence she had never read in its original form, but knew well enough by now. She held it for a moment with the same careful attention she would give any document that contained important information. Then she folded it precisely and set it back down. "Keep it," she said. He looked at her. "It belongs in the record," she said. "You are right about that." She met his eyes. "The complete record is more honest than the edited one. My father taught me that." She paused. "Besides, I find I am not afraid of it anymore. What it says about me. It is simply what someone believed once before they knew what they were looking at." He looked at her for a long moment, with the full, clear, genuine attention that was the most constant thing she had come to rely on in him. The attention that had not wavered from the first time it was directed at her in the estate office doorway, that had held through the inquiry, and the gathering, and the 4 months of waiting, and the winter, and everything that had changed, and everything that had not. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes," she said. "I should like to show you something," he said. He reached to the side of his desk and turned the open journal toward her. The journal she had seen him writing in the previous month, the pages of precise angular script. He had turned to a specific entry. She could see from the quality of the handwriting slightly more deliberate than his ordinary working hand, the kind of care given to something being set down for, keeps that it had been written with intention. She read it. "I spent my life believing that a man's greatest duty was protecting his name." 11 years of managing the distance between what Ravensley required and what I personally felt, under the conviction that the distance was the correct response, that duty and feeling were opposing forces, and duty was always the correct answer. She taught me that a name without love is only a word, that duty applied without honesty is simply a more respectable form of concealment, that the thing I was protecting by keeping people at a careful distance was not Ravensley or the family's name or anyone else's well-being. It was myself. And the self I was protecting was a great deal smaller and a great deal less worth protecting than the life I was declining to live. I am not certain I would have understood any of this without her. I am certain that I would not have understood it without her willingness to tell me true things when the easier thing would have been to agree with me. The world called her difficult. The world did not know what it was looking at. I did. Eventually. That is the only part of this story I am proud of, that I looked carefully enough long enough to see the thing that was actually there. She looked up from the journal. Alexander was watching her with the expression that was more personal than a smile, the one that appeared when nothing was being managed, when he was simply accurately entirely present. She said, "You write honestly when no one is reading." "I write honestly," he said, "because you have made dishonesty feel like a waste of perfectly good paper." She laughed. It came out the way laughter comes when it is not being managed suddenly and fully and with the specific quality of something that has been waiting to arrive for quite some time. She put her hand over her mouth, not from embarrassment, but from the slight surprise of it, and she looked at him laughing in the study of Ravensley in January, with the winter light through the windows and the letter folded on the desk between them, and she felt something she could not name as a single thing, because it was composed of too many accurate things simultaneously. She had been told her whole life that she was too much. She understood now that she had simply been in the wrong room. They were married in March at Ravensley Chapel. The chapel was small. It had served the estate's household for 2 centuries and had not been built with large occasions in mind, which suited them both. The guest list was precise. Mr. Crane and his wife, the county land agent, and his, Thomas, the estate manager, who had served Ravensley through 11 years of Alexander's careful stewardship, and who sat in the front pew with the expression of a man confirming a conclusion he had formed some months ago and found the confirmation deeply satisfying. Lady Margaret's sister, a pleasant woman from Derbyshire, who had never had any part in the arrangements of the previous summer and whose presence Eleanor had suggested because she had liked her the one time they had met and because the chapel should have warm people in it. Constance, who had written Eleanor a letter in October that was the most honest thing her cousin had ever communicated to her, and who sat in the second row with a genuine expression Eleanor found she was glad to see. No announcement had been made in advance to the county's broader social world. There was no formal notice, no strategic communication designed to manage the reception of the news. They had simply arranged to be married in the chapel in March because it was what they intended to do. The morning was early spring, the particular English March that is still cold, but carries within it the definite intention of warmth where the light has changed, even if the temperature has not, and you understand from the quality of it that the year has turned and is now heading somewhere better. Eleanor walked to the chapel through the Ravensley grounds in her best dress, deep blue, the color she had come to think of as accurate, the color of knowing what she was, with the Ferguson drainage treatise tucked improbably under her arm because she had been reading it at breakfast and set it down, and then on reflection decided that carrying something of her father's into the chapel was not impractical at all, but simply true. The chapel door was open. Alexander was standing at the front of it, turned toward her as she entered. No performance, no managed composure, simply himself in the clear morning light, watching her walk toward him with the full attention that had been the first honest thing she knew about him, and had not diminished by a fraction of a degree in all the months since. She walked the length of the small chapel. She stopped beside him. She was not nervous. She had thought about this carefully, the same way she thought about everything, and she had understood that what she felt was not nervousness, but the specific gravity of a true thing being acknowledged publicly, the weight of saying out loud what she had known privately for long enough that the knowing had become simply part of the structure of herself. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside the chapel windows, the Ravensley grounds were doing what grounds do in early spring, quietly without announcement, beginning to return to themselves. The gardens that had been resting under the winter were showing the first signs of what they would become when the warmth arrived. The oak trees at the boundary held the particular stillness of things about to grow. The drainage channels on the north field ran clear and correctly because the problem had been properly identified and properly addressed by someone who understood what they were looking at. She thought about a letter that had described her as a problem to be solved before she became an embarrassment. She thought about a man who had read that letter and decided before he ever met her that the person described in it deserved to be looked at more carefully. She thought about her father's handwriting in the margins of his books, the questions he had asked in pencil, the trust he had placed in her to find the answers, the confidence he had held in her capacity to know what to do and when to do it. She thought I knew. She thought I did it. She thought here is the when. The ceremony was brief and honest, conducted by the village rector who had known Alexander since childhood, and who spoke without elaboration or ceremony about the nature of the commitment being made, which was simply that two people had found in each other the particular rare quality of genuine understanding and were choosing to continue toward it together with intention for the rest of the time available to them. When it was done, when the words had been said, and the register signed in both their hands side by side on the same page, equally present, equally recorded, Alexander turned to her and looked at her with the expression that was the truest thing his face could do, the one that had no management in it at all. He said very quietly, so that it was only for her, "There you are." She understood immediately what he meant. She thought of her father's voice when she brought him a finished restoration, every damaged document she had stabilized and repaired and returned to legibility, the ones everyone had given up on, the ones that had been through flood and fire and deliberate removal and the ordinary accumulation of time's neglect. He would look at them for a long moment with the careful attention of someone seeing both what something was and what it had survived to become, and then he would say, "There it is. There it always was." She looked at Alexander, at the man who had read a letter that wasn't meant for him, and followed it to the person it underestimated who had come back 4 times before he admitted to himself why he was coming, who had stood in a garden gathering in front of 80 witnesses and said the true thing because the alternative was the dishonest thing, and he was not willing to be dishonest. She said, "There you are too." He took her hand. Not the brief, careful gesture of a man managing his own intentions. Simply her hand held in the morning light of a small chapel in early spring, in the presence of the people who had witnessed everything worth witnessing. Outside Ravensleigh waited the grounds and the gardens and the archive and the workrooms and the north field drainage running clear. The long, solid, centuries-old house with its high windows and its history and all the rooms that were now simply rooms where people lived. The life she had not known she was walking toward when she had first lifted her chin and told her aunt quietly that perhaps she was never meant to be placed. She had been right about that. She was not meant to be placed. She was meant to find her own ground measure, it carefully establish it on accurate terms, and choose it freely. She had done all of these things. She was standing on her own ground now in a chapel in March, holding the hand of a man who had learned 11 years later than was comfortable, but not too late to matter, that a name without love was only a word. The rector said something final and formal that neither of them would later be able to precisely quote. And the morning continued clear and true into the rest of it.